What if I told you that for 3 decades, an entire American family lived under the same roof with one of the most dangerous men in their city, and they had absolutely no idea? Picture this. Every Sunday afternoon, a loving grandfather sits at the kitchen table, reading glasses perched on his nose, meticulously filling out crossword puzzles from the New York Times while his grandchildren play at his feet. Harmless, right? Wrong. Devastatingly wrong. Because those weren't just puzzles. They were encrypted messages to the Kremlin. They were KGB codes hidden in plain sight, right there on the kitchen table, between the coffee cups and the family photos. This is the story of Viktor Petrov, the man who fooled an entire nation, who built a life on lies so convincing that even his own wife never suspected the truth. A Soviet spy who became an American grandfather, a Cold War operative who coached Little League and baked cookies. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just destroy secrets, it shattered a family. How does a man live 2 lives so completely that neither one seems like a lie? How do you reconcile loving someone who was never really who they said they were? Stay with us, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about trust, loyalty, and the terrifying reality that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in the most innocent places. Portland, Oregon. A city where the rain falls soft and steady, where bridges arch over the Willamette River like steel sentinels, and where neighborhoods bloom with rose gardens and coffee shops on every corner. In the quiet suburb of Laurelhurst, where century-old oak trees line streets of craftsman homes and families know each other by name, there lived a man who seemed to embody everything good about the American dream. His name was Victor Peterson. At least, that's what everyone called him. Victor was 78 years old, with silver hair that he kept neatly combed, kind blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and hands that trembled just slightly, a reminder of his age. He lived in a modest 2-story house painted pale yellow, with a front porch where he'd sit every morning, rain or shine, drinking coffee and waving to neighbors as they walked their dogs. The Peterson house was the kind of place that smelled like cinnamon and old books, where the hardwood floors creaked in all the right places, and where everyone was always welcome. Victor had moved to Portland in 1983, he told everyone, after immigrating from Ukraine in the late 70s. He'd worked as a mathematics professor at a community college for 20 years before retiring, and now he spent his days tending to his garden, playing chess at the local community center, and most notably completing crossword puzzles. It was his signature hobby, his daily ritual. Every morning, without fail, Victor would sit at the oak kitchen table with the newspaper spread before him, a mechanical pencil in hand, and work through the crossword puzzle with intense concentration. His wife, Margaret, an American woman he'd married in 1985, would often joke about his obsession. "That man loves his puzzles more than he loves me," she'd say with a warm laugh, bringing him another cup of coffee. Margaret was a retired nurse, practical and warm-hearted, with short grey hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around her neck. They'd met at a church social, and their romance had been sweet and simple. She'd never questioned his past, never doubted his stories about growing up in Kyiv, about leaving Soviet Ukraine for a better life in America. Why would she? He was gentle, intelligent, and devoted to their family. Together they had one son, Thomas, who worked as an accountant in downtown Portland. Thomas had given them 2 grandchildren, Sarah, now 32, and working as an attorney in Seattle, and Michael, 28, a high school teacher right there in Portland. Those grandchildren were Victor's pride and joy. He attended every school play, every soccer game, every graduation. He taught them chess, helped with their math homework, and told them stories about the old country, carefully edited versions that painted a picture of a simpler time. Sunday dinners at the Peterson house were legendary in the family. Margaret would cook her famous pot roast, Victor would set the table with military precision, and the family would gather around, sharing stories and laughter. After dinner, Victor would retreat to his favorite armchair by the window, crossword puzzle in hand, while the family cleaned up and the grandchildren showed him their latest achievements. It was picture perfect, almost too perfect. The neighbors adored him. Mrs. Chen from next door would bring him homemade dumplings, and he'd help her son with algebra. Mr. Rodriguez across the street would join him for chess matches on Thursday afternoons. Victor was patient, courteous, and always had a kind word. He volunteered at the local library, organizing the foreign language section. He donated to veterans' charities. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen, a gentle soul, a loving grandfather. But there were small things, tiny inconsistencies that no one thought to question. The way Victor would tense up when a Russian news story came on television, then quickly relax and change the channel. The locked drawer in his study that he claimed contained old tax documents, nothing interesting. The fact that he never ever wanted to be photographed, always finding an excuse to be behind the camera instead of in front of it. The occasional phone call he'd take in the garage, speaking in hushed tones, claiming it was an old colleague from the university. His crossword puzzle habit was particularly intense. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession bordering on compulsion. He completed the New York Times crossword every single day, but he also subscribed to obscure puzzle magazines, international publications that arrived in brown paper wrapping. He'd spend hours on a single puzzle, erasing and rewriting, muttering to himself in what everyone assumed was Ukrainian. Sometimes he'd mail his completed puzzles to pen pals, he'd explain, other puzzle enthusiasts around the country who enjoyed comparing solutions. Margaret thought it was charming. The grandchildren thought it was quirky. None of them realized they were watching a master spy at work. Victor's daily routine was clockwork precise. Wake at 6:30. Coffee and the morning crossword by 7. A walk around the neighborhood by 8:30. Lunch at noon. An afternoon puzzle. Dinner with Margaret. Evening news. Bed by 10. It was the routine of a man with nothing to hide. A man whose life was an open book. Except that every single element of that routine, every puzzle, every walk, every carefully timed moment, was part of an elaborate cover. A performance so perfected over decades that it had become indistinguishable from reality. In his study, a small room on the second floor with a window overlooking the rose garden, Victor kept his puzzle collection meticulously organized. Hundreds of completed puzzles, filed by date and publication. Books on cryptography, disguised as mathematics textbooks. A shortwave radio hidden inside an old television cabinet. And that locked drawer containing items that would have sent his loving family running in terror if they'd ever seen what was inside. But they never looked. Why would they? This was Victor Peterson, beloved grandfather, retired professor, crossword enthusiast. This was the man who cried at his granddaughter's wedding. The man who taught his grandson to ride a bike. The man who held Margaret's hand during movies and told her she was beautiful even after 40 years of marriage. This was a good man, a safe man, a man who could be trusted. Or so they thought. The truth, the devastating truth that would eventually tear through this family like a hurricane through a paper house, was that Victor Peterson didn't exist. He never had. The man sitting at that kitchen table, smiling at his grandchildren, working his crossword puzzles with such innocent dedication, was actually Viktor Petrov, a former KGB officer who had been living as an illegal, a deep cover operative embedded in American society for over 3 decades. And those crossword puzzles, they weren't puzzles at all. They were coded messages, sophisticated ciphers developed during his training in Moscow, communications with his handlers that had been hidden in plain sight for 30 years. Every single day of his American life had been a lie. Every smile, every story, every moment of apparent normalcy had been carefully constructed by a man trained to deceive at the highest level. And the worst part, the truly heartbreaking part, was that somewhere along the way Victor had actually fallen in love with the lie. He loved his American family, he loved his American life, but he'd never been able to stop being what he truly was, a spy. The perfect grandfather was a perfect illusion, and when that illusion finally shattered, it would leave wounds that might never heal. If you're captivated by this story and want to know what happens next, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who appreciates unbelievable stories. Because what's coming next will shock you even more. To understand Viktor Petrov, we must travel back to a different time, a different world. Moscow, 1962. The Cold War was at its frozen height. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, and in the shadowy corridors of the KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Square, the Soviet Union was recruiting its next generation of spies. Viktor Nikolaevich Petrov was 22 years old, a brilliant mathematics student at Moscow State University when he was approached. He'd grown up in a small apartment in a grey concrete block on the outskirts of Moscow, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher. Life in the Soviet Union was hard but predictable. You worked, you served the state, you kept your head down. But Viktor was different. He had a gift for numbers, for patterns, for seeing connections where others saw only chaos. His professors noticed. And more importantly, the KGB noticed. The recruitment happened in winter, as these things always did in Moscow. A man in a dark coat approached him after class, introduced himself as a representative from a special government mathematics program, and invited Viktor for tea. That tea meeting changed everything. Within months, Viktor was pulled from university and sent to a training facility outside Moscow, a place that officially didn't exist, where he would spend the next 3 years learning to become someone else entirely. The training was brutal and comprehensive. He learned to shoot, to fight, to resist interrogation. But more importantly, he learned to lie, to become a different person so completely that even he would sometimes forget who he really was. He studied American culture obsessively, baseball statistics, Hollywood movies, regional accents, political systems, social customs. He learned to think like an American, to dream like an American, to be an American. His specialty was cryptography. Viktor had always been gifted with codes and ciphers, and the KGB honed that talent into a lethal skill. He learned dozens of encryption methods, from classical substitution ciphers to sophisticated modern techniques. He learned steganography, the art of hiding messages in plain sight, and he learned about dead drops, brush passes, covert communications, all the tradecraft of espionage. His trainers told him he was one of the best they'd ever seen, intelligent, patient, and most crucially, utterly forgettable. He had the kind of face that blended into any crowd, the kind of personality that people liked but never quite remembered. In 1967, at age 27, Viktor was given his assignment. He would become an illegal, a deep-cover operative with no official connection to the Soviet government. Unlike embassy spies who had diplomatic immunity, illegals were on their own. If caught, Moscow would deny they existed. They were ghosts, living lies, and their mission was long-term infiltration. Viktor would go to America, establish himself, build a life, and wait. Wait for years, perhaps decades, slowly gathering information and maintaining a covert communication channel with Moscow. He might never be activated for a major operation, but he would always be there, a sleeper agent, ready if needed. Before he left, Viktor was allowed one final visit with his mother. His father had died 2 years earlier, and his mother lived alone in that same grey apartment. He couldn't tell her the truth, of course. He told her he was taking a job opportunity abroad, that he might not be able to write often. She held his face in her worn hands and said, "Be safe, my son. Remember who you are." He promised he would. It was a promise he would break in ways she could never imagine. In 1969, Viktor left Moscow. His route was circuitous and carefully planned, first to East Berlin, then to Vienna, then to Mexico City, and finally across the border into the United States through Texas. He carried flawless documentation identifying him as Viktor Peterson, a Ukrainian immigrant fleeing Soviet oppression. It was beautiful, really, the irony of it. A Soviet spy pretending to be a refugee from Soviet tyranny. The Americans welcomed him with open arms. He spent his first 2 years in America in New York, working odd jobs, perfecting his English and establishing his legend. He enrolled in night classes, eventually earning a degree in mathematics. He made friends, carefully cultivated relationships, became a regular at a local diner. He was building a life brick by brick, lie by lie. In 1971, his handlers instructed him to relocate to the West Coast. Portland was chosen for its large immigrant community, its progressive politics, and its proximity to important military and technology installations. It was perfect. Viktor found work as a mathematics teacher, first in high schools, then at a community college. He was good at it. No, he was excellent at it. He genuinely enjoyed teaching, enjoyed watching students grasp complex concepts. That was one of the strange contradictions of his existence. Parts of his cover life became real. The teaching wasn't fake. The satisfaction he felt when a struggling student finally understood calculus, that was genuine. But always underneath everything was the mission. He maintained contact with Moscow through a complex system of coded communications. Initially, it was dead drops, leaving microfilm in hollowed-out coins in predetermined locations. Later, as technology evolved, it became more sophisticated. But his primary method, the one he would use for decades, was the crossword puzzle system. It was elegant in its simplicity and nearly unbreakable. He would encode messages using a substitution cipher based on specific puzzle solutions, then mail his completed puzzles to addresses that were actually KGB front operations. To any observer, even a trained investigator, they were just crossword puzzles. A harmless hobby. In his early years, Victor mostly gathered low-level information, names of defense contractors, details about port security, economic data. Nothing dramatic, but everything useful. He would photograph documents, memorize conversations, make careful observations, and send it all back to Moscow, hidden in the neat rows of crossword squares. He was patient, never pushing, never taking unnecessary risks. The perfect illegal. Then, in 1984, something unexpected happened. He met Margaret. She was a nurse at the hospital where he'd gone for a routine checkup. They struck up a conversation in the waiting room. She was kind, intelligent, and had a laugh that made him smile despite himself. They started dating. Victor knew it was risky. Personal attachments were dangerous for an illegal, but his handlers in Moscow approved. A wife would make his cover more complete, more believable. An older bachelor was slightly suspicious. A married man with a family was above suspicion. He told himself it was just part of the job. But when he married Margaret in 1985, in a small ceremony at a Portland church with a handful of friends present, he felt something he hadn't expected. Happiness. Real, genuine happiness. For a moment, standing there in his rented tuxedo, watching Margaret walk down the aisle in her simple white dress, Victor forgot he was a spy. He was just a man, grateful and terrified, and in love. Their son Thomas was born in 1986. When Victor held that tiny, crying infant in his arms at the hospital, looking down at the baby's scrunched-up face, he felt his heart crack open in a way he'd never experienced. This was his son, his blood, and this child would grow up never knowing the truth about his father. Victor made a decision in that moment, a dangerous decision for a spy. He would protect this family. Whatever else happened, whatever Moscow demanded, he would keep them safe. The years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and Victor wondered if his mission was over. But Moscow, now Russian intelligence, re-established contact. They still had uses for him. The Cold War might be over, but espionage never ended. He continued his work, though his heart was less in it now. He was getting older. He had a family to think about. He had grandchildren, for God's sake. Sarah was born in 1987, Michael in 1991. Beautiful children who called him Grandpa and climbed into his lap to hear stories. Victor found himself living in a strange twilight. He was a grandfather who baked cookies and attended school plays. He was also a spy who still encoded messages and maintained contact with Russian intelligence. Two lives, two identities, existing simultaneously in the same body. And increasingly the grandfather was winning. He loved his family. He loved his life. The mission had become habit more than passion. He kept his skills sharp, maintained his protocols, sent his reports. But his heart was no longer in Moscow. It was here, in this yellow house in Portland, with these people who thought they knew him, but he could never stop, never truly quit. Because the truth was there was no resignation letter for men like him. You served until you died, or until you were caught. Those were the only two exits, and Victor had secrets, so many secrets, buried so deep that unearthing them would destroy everything and everyone he loved. So he kept doing the crossword puzzles, kept encoding the messages, kept living the lie. Because what choice did he have? The ghost from Moscow had become an American grandfather, but ghosts never fully disappear. They linger, waiting in the shadows, until one day, inevitably, someone turns on the light. What do you think so far? Drop your opinion in the comments. Do you believe someone can truly love a life built on lies? Let us know your thoughts. If you've watched this far, you're truly invested in this incredible story, and we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for sticking with us. What you're about to discover next is the most fascinating part of Victor's double life, and trust us when we say the best is still coming. Stay tuned. The beauty of Victor's operation was in its mundane appearance. Every morning, like clockwork, he would sit at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the Portland Tribune or the New York Times spread before him, and begin working on the crossword puzzle. His pencil would move deliberately across the squares, filling in words, erasing occasionally, muttering to himself. Margaret would walk by, kiss the top of his head, and never think twice about what she was witnessing. The neighbors who visited would see him hunched over his puzzle and smile at the dedicated hobbyist. His grandchildren would do their homework at the same table, while Grandpa did his brain exercises. No one suspected they were watching a master cryptographer at work. The system Victor used was a variation of a classic KGB technique, adapted and perfected over decades. Here's how it worked. He would receive instructions through a numbers station, a shortwave radio broadcast of seemingly random numbers that actually contained coded messages. These stations operated on specific frequencies at specific times, broadcasting from locations unknown. To anyone scanning the airwaves, they sounded like meaningless sequences. To trained operatives like Victor, they were detailed instructions. The numbers station would tell him which crossword puzzle to use, which specific publication and date. It would provide him with a key, a specific word or phrase that would unlock the cipher. Then Victor would purchase that particular puzzle, complete it normally. But within the completed puzzle, he would embed his message using a substitution cipher. Certain letters, when read in a specific sequence determined by the key, would spell out his intelligence report. For example, if the key was Portland, he would look at the first letter of every eighth word in the puzzle, the eighth letter because P is the eighth letter of the alphabet, and continue through the sequence. The resulting letters would form his message. He would then mail this completed puzzle to an address that changed regularly, usually presented as a subscription service or a puzzle enthusiast newsletter. These addresses were KGB dead drops, where his messages would be collected, decoded and forwarded to Moscow. The genius was in the deniability. A completed crossword puzzle looked exactly like a completed crossword puzzle. There was no invisible ink, no microfilm, no suspicious materials. If intercepted, if investigated, it would appear to be exactly what it was, an elderly man's hobby. The cipher was unbreakable without the key, and the key was never written down, never repeated, always delivered through the numbers station. But Victor didn't just receive instructions. He gathered intelligence. Portland in the 1980s and 1990s was home to significant military and technology interests. There were defense contractors, semiconductor companies, shipping operations with ties to the Pacific Fleet. Victor's job wasn't to steal classified documents or infiltrate secure facilities. That was too risky and too obvious. His job was to collect the kind of information that seemed innocuous, but when combined with thousands of other data points, created a valuable intelligence picture. He would attend community meetings and note which companies were hiring, what kind of specialists they needed. He would befriend engineers and executives at the community center's chess club, learning about their work through casual conversation. He would read local business journals, noting contract awards and project announcements. He would observe ship movements at the port, photograph buildings during his morning walks, and map infrastructure. All of this information, seemingly harmless pieces of a larger puzzle, would be encoded into his crosswords and sent to Moscow. Over the years, Victor's intelligence contributed to larger operations he never fully understood. His report about a semiconductor plant's expansion might have helped Russian intelligence understand American manufacturing capabilities. His observations about port security could have aided in planning covert operations. His list of defense contractor employees might have identified recruitment targets. He was just one small piece of a massive machine, but every piece mattered. The work required incredible discipline and attention to detail. Victor maintained a perfect cover for over 30 years. He never slipped, never broke character, never gave anyone reason to question his identity. He memorized his legend so thoroughly that he could recite his fake childhood in Ukraine with tears in his eyes. He learned to love what his cover loved: teaching, gardening, family dinners, crossword puzzles. The line between Viktor Petrov and Viktor Peterson blurred until even he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. But there were costs. The psychological toll of maintaining a double identity for decades was enormous. Viktor couldn't share his true self with anyone. He couldn't talk about his real childhood in Moscow, his mother, his training, his fears. Margaret would ask him about his past, and he would tell carefully rehearsed stories, mixing lies with just enough truth to be convincing. His son would ask about relatives in Ukraine, and Viktor would invent elaborate family trees of people who didn't exist. He was utterly alone, trapped in a performance with no intermission and no final curtain. There were close calls over the years. In 1987, a KGB defector revealed details about illegal operations in the United States, and for 6 months, Viktor lived in constant fear that his name would surface. It didn't, but the stress aged him visibly. Margaret thought he was having health problems and insisted he see a doctor. The doctor found nothing wrong physically. The problem was in his mind, in the crushing weight of secrets he could never share. In 1994, the FBI arrested another illegal in Seattle, less than 200 miles away. Viktor followed the news obsessively, analyzing every detail of how the spy had been caught. The man had made small mistakes, inconsistencies in his story, suspicious financial transactions, unusual travel patterns. Viktor reviewed his own procedures, tightened his protocols, eliminated any possible vulnerability. He became even more careful, even more paranoid. The walls were closing in, slowly but inexorably. Yet through it all, the crossword puzzles continued. Every single day, without fail, for 30 years. Thousands of puzzles, thousands of encoded messages, a constant stream of intelligence flowing from a kitchen table in Portland to the intelligence services in Moscow. It was one of the longest-running, most successful illegal operations in the history of modern espionage. And no one suspected a thing. Viktor's handlers in Moscow were pleased with his work. He received occasional recognition through coded messages, compliments hidden in numbers station broadcasts. But he never felt pride, only a weary resignation. This was his life. He'd chosen it, or it had chosen him, and there was no way out. He was the man who couldn't come in from the cold, because no one knew he was out in it. His relationship with his family became both his greatest joy and his deepest torment. He loved them desperately, completely. When his grandson Michael graduated from college, Viktor cried genuine tears of pride. When his granddaughter Sarah got married, he danced with her at the reception and told her she was the most beautiful bride he'd ever seen, and he meant every word. These were real emotions, real connections. The family he'd built as cover had become his actual family. The life he'd constructed as camouflage had become the life he wanted to live. But he could never tell them the truth, never explain who he really was. They loved Viktor Peterson, the kind grandfather, the patient teacher. They would hate Viktor Petrov, the Soviet spy, the deceiver, the threat to their country. He was living a love story with a time bomb hidden in its foundation. Every moment of happiness was poisoned by the knowledge that one day, somehow, the truth would emerge and destroy everything. In his private moments, alone in his study at night while Margaret slept, Viktor would sometimes take out an old photograph, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his real life. It showed him as a young man in Moscow, standing with his mother in front of their apartment building, both of them smiling stiffly for the camera. He would look at that photograph and barely recognize the person he'd been. That young, idealistic Soviet officer who'd believed he was serving a great cause seemed like a stranger now. Viktor didn't know what he believed anymore. He'd lost his country, his identity, his very self. All he had left was the family who didn't know him and the mission he couldn't escape. The cipher was in plain sight, hidden in crossword puzzles on a kitchen table. But the real cipher was Viktor himself, a man whose true identity was so deeply buried that even he struggled to find it. A puzzle with no solution, a code that could never be broken because the key had been lost decades ago, and the clock was ticking. Because secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of rising to the surface, and when they do, they bring everything crashing down with them. We are grateful you've stayed with us this far. This journey is reaching its most intense moments, and what comes next will leave you breathless. The end began on a Tuesday in March 2019, with a phone call that Margaret would replay in her mind 1,000 times afterward, searching for clues she'd missed. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. She was at the grocery store, deciding between 2 brands of pasta sauce, when her phone rang. It was a neighbor, Mrs. Chen, her voice tight with worry. "Margaret, you need to come home. Victor collapsed in the garden. The ambulance is here." By the time Margaret arrived, her heart pounding and her hands shaking, they were already loading Victor into the ambulance. He was conscious but confused, his words slurring. "Stroke," the paramedic said. They needed to get him to Providence Portland Medical Center immediately. Margaret rode with him, holding his hand, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. Victor looked at her with those blue eyes that had always been so kind, so steady, and for just a moment, she saw something there she'd never seen before. Fear. Not fear of death, but fear of something else, something deeper. He tried to speak. His mouth moved, forming words that wouldn't come. "The drawer," he finally managed. "The drawer. Study. I'm sorry." "Shh," Margaret told him, squeezing his hand. "Don't try to talk. Save your strength." "Should have told you," he whispered, tears running down his weathered cheeks. "Should have. So many years." Then they were at the hospital, and he was rushed into emergency care, and Margaret was left in a waiting room with terrible coffee and mounting dread. Sarah and Michael arrived within hours. Thomas came from work, still in his suit, looking pale and frightened. They waited together as doctors worked to stabilize Victor. The stroke was serious but not fatal. He would survive, they were told, though recovery would be long and difficult. He remained in the hospital for a week. When he came home, he was diminished, moving slowly with a walker, his speech still slightly impaired. But he was alive, and the family rallied around him with love and determination. They set up a bedroom on the first floor. They arranged for home nursing care. They adjusted their lives to accommodate his needs, because that's what families do. But Victor had changed in ways that went beyond the physical damage of the stroke. He seemed haunted, agitated. He would wake from nightmares, calling out in Russian, words his family couldn't understand. He kept asking about his study, about that locked drawer, becoming distressed when told everything was fine. It was all still there, waiting for him. Margaret assured him repeatedly that nothing had been touched, but this seemed to upset him more rather than less. 3 weeks after the stroke, Victor died in his sleep. The doctors said it was another stroke, a massive one this time. There was nothing anyone could have done. One moment he was sleeping peacefully, Margaret beside him, and the next he was simply gone. Just like that. 78 years of life over in a heartbeat. The family was devastated, but also, in some small way, relieved that he hadn't suffered, hadn't deteriorated further. He'd lived a good life, they told themselves. He'd been loved. He'd been happy. They held the funeral on a cloudy Saturday, the kind of soft grey day that Portland does so well. Half the neighborhood attended. Former students, chess partners from the community center, library volunteers. The church was packed with people whose lives Victor had touched. The eulogies were beautiful and heartfelt. Thomas spoke about his father's dedication to family. Michael talked about learning chess and patience from his grandfather. Sarah, her voice breaking, described the man who'd always encouraged her dreams, who'd believed in her when she doubted herself. No one mentioned Ukraine much, or Victor's past before America, because, truthfully, they knew so little about it. It had always seemed like a painful subject, something Victor preferred not to discuss. They respected his privacy. They always had. That respect, that unconditional love, would soon seem like the cruelest form of blindness. After the funeral, the family gathered at the Yellow House in Laurelhurst to begin the difficult process of sorting through Victor's belongings. It's a strange thing, going through a loved one's possessions. Every object holds a memory. Every photograph tells a story. Every trinket represents a moment of their life. Margaret couldn't bear to do it alone, so Sarah volunteered to help. Mother and daughter went through Victor's closet, his dresser, his bookshelves, crying together, laughing at silly mementos, sharing memories. Then Sarah went up to Victor's study, the small room on the second floor with its window overlooking the rose garden where Victor had spent so many hours. It was neat and orderly, as he'd always kept it. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with mathematics texts and puzzle collections. His desk held a reading lamp, a pencil holder, a photograph of the family. On another wall, filing cabinets contained hundreds of completed crossword puzzles, meticulously organized by date and publication. His beloved puzzles. The family had joked about maybe framing some of them, a quirky memorial to a quirky man. Sarah was looking for Victor's address book, trying to compile a list of people to send thank-you notes to for their attendance at the funeral. She checked the desk drawers, finding nothing but pens and paper clips and old bills. Then she remembered something. That locked drawer. Victor had been so agitated about it in the hospital. The drawer, the study, he'd said. Sarah had assumed he was worried about important documents, maybe a will or insurance papers. She should check, make sure nothing important was missed. The drawer was in the lower right of the desk, a deep file drawer with a small brass lock. Sarah tried it, locked as expected. She searched for a key, checking the desktop, the other drawers, the top of the bookshelf. Nothing. She was about to give up when she noticed a small wooden box on the bookshelf, a decorative thing that she'd always assumed was empty. Inside, underneath a layer of old ticket stubs and buttons, was a tiny brass key. Her hands were shaking slightly as she unlocked the drawer. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct, some deep intuitive sense that she was about to cross a threshold she couldn't uncross. The lock clicked, the drawer slid open, and Sarah's life, her entire understanding of her family and her history, shattered like glass. Inside the drawer were objects that made no sense, that belonged in a spy movie, not in her grandfather's study. There was a passport, Russian, with Victor's photograph, but a different name, Viktor Nikolaevich Petrov. The birth date was 3 years earlier than the one they'd celebrated all her life. There were other identity documents, all in Russian, all with different variations of names and dates. There were photographs, old ones, showing Victor as a young man in what looked like a Soviet military uniform. Standing in front of buildings she recognized from pictures of Moscow, with other men in uniform. There was a small black notebook filled with handwritten notes in Russian, columns of numbers and letters that looked like some kind of code. There were maps of Portland with locations marked in Cyrillic. There were instructions, typed on yellowing paper, describing dead drop locations and signal protocols. There was a small shortwave radio, compact and sophisticated, clearly not a commercial device. And there, at the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, was a pistol, a Makarov PM, standard issue for Soviet intelligence officers. Sarah sat on the floor, unable to breathe, surrounded by these impossible objects. She picked up the Russian passport again, staring at the photograph. It was definitely her grandfather. Victor. Victor. 2 names for the same face. She flipped through the other documents, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. There had to be an explanation. Some kind of mistake. But deep down in that awful moment she knew. She understood. All those little inconsistencies she'd never questioned. The way he'd tense at Russian news, the strange phone calls, the obsessive puzzle hobby, the gaps in his personal history. It all made terrible, sickening sense. Her grandfather, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd attended her law school graduation with tears of pride in his eyes, who'd danced with her at her wedding, was a spy. A Russian spy. A KGB agent who'd been living a lie for decades. Sarah didn't know how long she sat there. Minutes? Hours? Time had stopped meaning anything. Eventually she heard her mother calling from downstairs, asking if she'd found the address book. Sarah's voice, when she managed to speak, sounded like it belonged to someone else, hollow and distant. "Mum, you need to come up here, right now." Margaret climbed the stairs, still wearing her funeral dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She entered the study and saw Sarah sitting on the floor, surrounded by documents and photographs, her face white as paper. "Honey, what's wrong? What did you find?" Sarah couldn't speak. She just handed her mother the Russian passport. Margaret looked at it, confused at first, then comprehending slowly, her expression moving through disbelief to horror to something that looked like her heart physically breaking. The passport fell from her hands, landing among the other documents scattered across the floor, evidence of a life she'd never known, of a man she'd never truly met. "No," Margaret whispered. "No, this isn't. There has to be." But there was no explanation that would make this okay. No innocent reason for a dead-drop protocol manual or a Soviet-issue handgun. No harmless excuse for multiple false identities and coded notebooks. The truth was lying there on the floor between them, undeniable and devastating. Sarah called Thomas, then Michael. Within 2 hours, the entire family was gathered in that study, staring at the contents of the drawer spread across Victor's desk like exhibits in a trial. They went through everything together, reading what they could, trying to understand. Thomas found a stack of letters, tucked into an envelope at the back of the drawer. They were in Russian, but the dates were recent, within the last 10 years, correspondence with someone in Moscow, ongoing contact. This hadn't been something from his distant past. This had been active, current. "We need to call the police," Michael said, his voice shaking. "Or the FBI. This is espionage. This is treason." "He's dead," Margaret said quietly, still staring at the passport photograph, at the young man who would become her husband, who would lie to her for 34 years. "What difference does it make now?" "What difference?" Sarah's voice was sharp, almost angry. "Mum, we don't know what he did, what information he gave them, what damage he caused. We don't know anything." "I know he loved us," Margaret insisted, but her voice cracked on the words. "I know that was real. It had to be real." "How do you know?" Thomas asked, and the question hung in the air like poison. How did they know anything? Every memory was now suspect. Every moment of their lives with Victor was now questionable. Was his love real, or was it just part of his cover? Were they his family, or were they his alibi? The questions multiplied, cancerous and corrosive, eating away at everything they thought they knew. They argued for hours about what to do. Michael insisted they had a duty to report this. Sarah agreed from a legal perspective. Thomas was torn, wanting to protect the family from scandal, but understanding the severity of what they'd discovered. Margaret just sat in Victor's chair, holding that photograph of him as a young Soviet officer, crying silently. In the end, Sarah made the decision. As the attorney in the family, she understood the legal implications of concealing this information. Early the next morning, she called the FBI field office in Portland and reported what they'd found. Within 3 hours, 2 agents arrived at the house. Special Agent Jennifer Hartwell and Special Agent Marcus Chen, both from the Counterintelligence Division. They were professional and courteous, but their presence transformed the Peterson home into a crime scene. The agents examined everything in the drawer, photographing each item, documenting serial numbers on the radio and the weapon. They asked questions, hundreds of questions. When did Victor immigrate? Who were his friends? What were his habits? Did he travel? Did he have any contact with Russians or Eastern Europeans? The family answered as best they could, but they realized with growing horror how little they actually knew. Victor had been a ghost in their lives, present but never fully visible. The agents took the documents, the radio, the gun, everything except the family photographs. Those at least they were allowed to keep, though even those now felt tainted. Agent Hartwell explained that there would be an investigation, that it might take months or even years to fully understand the scope of Victor's activities. The family would be contacted regularly, their finances would be examined, their own backgrounds would be scrutinized, because when you discover a spy in your family, everyone becomes a suspect. "Was our whole life a lie?" Margaret asked Agent Hartwell before they left. "Did any of it mean anything to him?" The agent looked at her with something like sympathy. "In my experience, Mrs. Peterson, the truth is usually complicated. Illegals often do develop genuine feelings for their cover families. The human heart doesn't always follow orders. But I can't tell you what he felt. I can only tell you what he did." What he did? That was the question that would haunt them. Over the following weeks, as the FBI investigation deepened, pieces of Victor's true activities began to emerge. The completed crossword puzzles weren't just hobbies. Cryptographic experts analyzed them, and confirmed they contained coded messages, sophisticated ciphers that had transmitted information for decades. The shortwave radio had been used to receive instructions from Russian intelligence. The maps and notebooks revealed a systematic collection of intelligence about Portland's infrastructure, defense contractors, and shipping operations. Viktor Petrov, beloved grandfather and retired math professor, had been an active KGB operative for over 30 years, and later, after the Soviet collapse, had continued working for Russian intelligence. The scope of his activities was staggering. He'd identified American defense personnel for potential recruitment. He'd reported on shipping movements and cargo manifests. He'd provided details about semiconductor manufacturing processes and emerging technologies. He'd been a goldmine of information, all gathered quietly, patiently, hidden behind the facade of a gentle old man doing crossword puzzles. The media got hold of the story within a week. "Suburban spy KGB operative lived secret life in Portland," read the headlines. News trucks camped outside the yellow house in Laurelhurst. Reporters shouted questions at the family whenever they appeared. The story went national, then international. Margaret's photograph appeared on television, identified as the widow of Soviet spy. Sarah and Michael were harassed at work. Thomas lost clients who didn't want to be associated with a traitor's family. The neighborhood turned on them. Mrs. Chen stopped speaking to Margaret. Mr. Rodriguez avoided eye contact. Former students of Victor's gave interviews expressing shock and betrayal. The community that had embraced the Peterson family now rejected them, as if they'd been complicit in the deception. The yellow house in Laurelhurst, once a place of warmth and welcome, became a prison of shame and suspicion. Margaret stopped sleeping. She would lie awake at night, replaying conversations, searching for clues she'd missed. How had she lived with him for 34 years and never known? What did that say about her, about their marriage? She'd thought she knew him better than anyone. She'd been certain of his love. Now she wasn't certain of anything. The man she'd mourned, whose funeral she'd arranged, whose loss had broken her heart, was a stranger. Or maybe not a stranger. Maybe he'd been both people simultaneously, spy and husband, liar and lover. The ambiguity was worse than clear-cut betrayal. Sarah found herself consumed with anger. She felt violated, manipulated. Every childhood memory now came with an asterisk. Every "I love you" from her grandfather now seemed suspect. Had he meant it? Or was she just a prop in his cover story? The little girl who'd adored her grandpa, who'd sat at his feet listening to his stories, felt foolish and used. She wanted to hate him, tried to hate him, but grief and love kept getting in the way. Michael retreated into himself, barely speaking to anyone. He'd been working on a family tree project with his students, talking about his Ukrainian heritage, his immigrant grandfather who'd pursued the American dream. Now that story was a lie, and he didn't know who he was anymore. If his grandfather's identity was false, what did that mean for his own? Thomas tried to be strong for everyone, tried to hold the family together, but the strain showed in his haggard face, his weight loss, the tremor in his hands. His father had been his hero, the man who'd taught him integrity and hard work. Finding out that same man was a spy, a traitor to the country Thomas loved, created a cognitive dissonance he couldn't resolve. The two images couldn't coexist, yet they had to, because they were the same person. The investigation continued through spring and into summer. The FBI interviewed everyone who'd known Victor, piecing together his network and his activities. They discovered he'd been in contact with at least 3 other Russian intelligence officers over the years, using the community center, the library, and local parks for meetings disguised as chess games or casual encounters. They found evidence of several dozen intelligence reports sent over the decades. Though without access to Russian archives, they couldn't know the full extent of the damage. And then, in August, Agent Hartwell called Sarah with unexpected news. They'd found something else, something that changed the picture significantly. Could the family come to the FBI office for a meeting? It was important. All of them needed to hear this. We're nearly at the end of this incredible journey, but you absolutely must stay until the final moments to understand what really happened. If you've made it this far, you're clearly captivated by this story, which means you'll love the other fascinating stories on our channel. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like so you don't miss what happens next. Trust us, you won't believe where this goes. The FBI field office in Portland was a modern building downtown, all glass and steel, imposing and institutional. The Peterson family sat together in a conference room on the 4th floor, united in their anxiety, but divided in their expectations. Margaret clutched a tissue. Sarah sat with her spine rigid, prepared for more revelations, more betrayals. Michael stared at the table. Thomas tried to read the expressions of the agents across from them, searching for clues about what was coming. Agent Hartwell spread several documents on the table, photocopies of letters, all handwritten in Russian with English translations attached. "We've had linguists and analysts going through everything we recovered from Victor's study," she began. "Most of it was exactly what we expected. Intelligence reports, operational protocols, contact instructions. But then we found these." She pushed the first letter forward. This was written by Victor and dated February 2010. It was never sent. We found it sealed in an envelope with instructions that it be delivered to his family after his death. But he must have forgotten about it or changed his mind, because it was still in his drawer. Sarah picked up the translation, her hands shaking. The letter was addressed to "My beloved family." She read aloud, her voice barely audible. "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have discovered the truth about who I was. I imagine you are hurt, angry, and confused. You have every right to be. I have lied to you every day of our lives together, and there is no forgiveness adequate for such deception. But before you consign my memory to hatred, please let me explain, not to excuse what I've done, but so you might understand." The letter went on, pages and pages in Victor's neat handwriting, telling the story of his recruitment, his training, his arrival in America. It described the loneliness of being an illegal, the psychological toll of constant deception. But then it shifted, and the tone changed completely. "When I met Margaret, something broke inside me, or perhaps something healed. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like a real person instead of a character I was playing. I fell in love with her. Truly, completely in love. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it violated every principle of my training. But I couldn't stop myself. And when Thomas was born, when I held my son in my arms, I knew I had made a terrible mistake, not in loving them, but in being unable to love them honestly." Margaret was crying openly now, reading over Sarah's shoulder. The letter continued. "I have lived in agony for decades, trapped between two lives, unable to fully commit to either. I loved my family with all my heart. Every moment with you was genuine. Every smile, every laugh, every tear was real. You were not my cover. You were my life. But I couldn't escape what I was, what I'd been trained to be. I continued my work for Moscow, not out of loyalty to Russia, but out of fear. Fear that if I stopped, if I tried to defect or disappear, they would hurt you. My handlers knew about you. They knew you were my weakness. I was trapped by my own love." Agent Chen spoke up. "We found references in his operational files to family members being used as leverage. It appears Victor's handlers did threaten the family, subtly but repeatedly, to ensure his continued cooperation. This was standard practice with illegals who developed personal attachments." The letter went on to describe Victor's increasing disillusionment with his work, his growing sense that he was serving no noble cause, but simply perpetuating an endless cycle of distrust and deception. He wrote about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and his hope that his mission would end, and his despair when Russian intelligence reactivated him. But then came the revelation that changed everything. Agent Hartwell pushed forward another set of documents. In 2012, Victor made a decision. He reached out to us, to the FBI. He wanted to become a double agent. He wanted to work for America. The room went silent. The family stared at the agent, unable to process what they'd just heard. "He what?" Sarah finally managed. "Victor approached one of our agents, someone he'd identified through his intelligence work, and offered to defect in place. He would continue his work for Russian intelligence, but he would report everything to us. His primary condition was that his family never know, that you all be protected from ever learning the truth. He wanted you to remember him as Victor Peterson, not Victor Petrov." Agent Hartwell opened a file folder, revealing years of reports. For 7 years, From 2012 until his death, Victor was one of our most valuable counterintelligence assets. Every piece of intelligence he sent to Moscow, he sent to us first. Every instruction he received, we knew about. We used him to feed disinformation to Russian intelligence, to identify their networks, to understand their priorities and methods. He helped us roll up 3 other illegal networks. He prevented the compromise of classified information. He quite possibly saved American lives. Margaret's hands covered her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Thomas leaned back in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. Sarah and Michael exchanged looks of pure shock. "Why?" Margaret whispered. "Why did he do it?" Agent Chen answered gently. "He told his handler, and I'm quoting from the file, 'I spent 30 years betraying the country my family calls home. I'd like to spend whatever time I have left protecting it. Not for politics or ideology, but for them. Because they're Americans and I love them and I want them to be safe.'" The agent pushed forward another letter, this one more recent. "He wrote individual letters to each of you, to be delivered if the truth ever came out. Would you like them now, or would you prefer time to process this?" "Now," Sarah said immediately. "Please, now." They each received an envelope with their name written in Victor's handwriting. Margaret's letter was the longest, pages and pages of apology and explanation and love. He wrote about the moment he'd met her, how her laugh had made him forget, just for an instant, who he really was. He wrote about their wedding day, how terrified and grateful he'd been. He wrote about the years of their marriage, the constant guilt of his deception, and the absolute certainty of his love. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," he wrote. "My only real regret is that I couldn't be honest with you, but everything else, every moment we shared, was true. I love you, Margaret. I always have. I always will." That, at least, was never a lie. Thomas's letter talked about the pride Victor felt, watching his son grow into a good man, better than Victor himself. He apologized for the legacy of deception, but hoped Thomas would understand that love doesn't require perfection, only sincerity. "You made me want to be better than I was," he wrote. "You gave me a reason to try to redeem myself." Sarah's letter addressed her directly as the lawyer she'd become, knowing she would be the one to discover the truth, knowing her analytical mind would struggle with the contradictions. "You always asked the hard questions, even as a child," he wrote. "So here's the answer to the hardest one. Yes, I loved you, completely, genuinely, without reservation. You were never part of my cover. You were the reason I wanted to come in from the cold. I'm sorry I waited so long. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was alive. But please know that your grandfather, whoever he really was prouder of you than words can express." Michael's letter was shorter, but no less emotional. Victor wrote about teaching him chess, about watching him become a teacher himself, about the joy of seeing his grandson follow in his footsteps, though hopefully with more honesty. "You have your whole life ahead of you," he wrote. "Don't let my mistakes define you. Be better than I was. Love honestly. Live authentically. That's all I ever wanted for you, but couldn't achieve myself." The family sat in that conference room for over an hour, reading and rereading their letters, crying, trying to understand, trying to reconcile the grandfather they'd loved with the spy he'd been and the double agent he'd become. It was too much to process, too complex to simply categorize as good or bad, hero or villain. Agent Hartwell gave them time, then spoke again. "There's one more thing you should know. The intelligence Victor provided in his final years was crucial to several ongoing counterintelligence operations. Just last month, we disrupted a major cyber attack on American financial institutions using information he'd gathered. We can't give you details, but his work, his redemption, if you will, had real impact. He saved lives and protected national security." "Can we tell anyone?" Thomas asked. "Can we clear his name publicly?" The agent shook her head. "The operations he contributed to are still classified. Revealing his work as a double agent would compromise ongoing investigations and potentially endanger other sources. I'm sorry, but officially, Viktor Petrov remains a Russian spy who died before he could be prosecuted. Only you and a handful of people in the intelligence community will ever know the whole truth." So the family would have to live with the knowledge that Victor had tried to make amends, had spent his final years working to undo his earlier betrayals. But the world would never know. The media would continue to portray him as a traitor. The neighbors would continue to shun the Peterson family. The history books, if they mentioned him at all, would list him among America's enemies. But they would know. They would know that the man who'd raised them, who'd loved them, who'd made terrible choices but tried to correct them, was more complicated than any simple label could capture. He was a spy and a grandfather, a liar and a lover, a betrayer who became a protector. He was all of these things, simultaneously, impossibly, painfully human. Over the following months, the family began the slow process of healing. It wasn't easy. The media attention eventually faded, though the stigma lingered. Margaret sold the yellow house in Laurelhurst, unable to live with the memories and the ghosts. She moved to a small apartment downtown, started seeing a therapist, slowly rebuilt her life. She kept the photograph of Victor in his Soviet uniform on her bedside table, alongside their wedding photo. Both versions of him, both true in their own way. Sarah eventually forgave him, or forgave herself for still loving him despite everything. She started a private practice specializing in immigration law, helping refugees and asylum seekers, people caught between countries and identities, people trying to build new lives from complicated pasts. In a way, she was continuing Victor's final mission, protecting those who needed it, regardless of where they came from. Michael returned to teaching with renewed purpose. He talked to his students about the complexity of identity, about how people can change, about the importance of second chances. He told them, without revealing the details, that he'd learned you could love someone and disagree with their choices, that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, just understanding. Thomas struggled the most, but eventually found peace in a support group for families of intelligence operatives. He discovered he wasn't alone, that there were others who'd learned shocking truths about loved ones, who'd had to reconcile contradictory realities. They helped each other understand that love isn't negated by deception, that relationships are valid even when based on incomplete information, that the heart knows truths the mind can't always access. The crossword puzzles, all those hundreds of completed puzzles, were returned to the family after the investigation concluded. Sarah suggested they burn them, erase that part of Victor's legacy. But Margaret refused. Instead, she had some of them framed and hung them in her new apartment, reminders of complexity, evidence that even coded messages could contain truth. Proof that her husband had existed in those moments, pencil in hand, constructing ciphers and building a life doing terrible and noble things simultaneously. In the end, what can we say about Viktor Nikolaevich Petrov, also known as Victor Peterson? That he was a spy who betrayed his adopted country for decades. Yes. That he was a grandfather who loved his family with genuine devotion. Also yes. That he tried in his final years to atone for his sins by serving the country he'd once betrayed. Yes, that too. All of these truths coexist, contradictory and inseparable. His story doesn't have a neat moral. Real life rarely does. But perhaps the lesson, if there is one, is this. People are capable of both great harm and great love. Sometimes in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same moment. Redemption is possible, though it's often incomplete and unseen. And the families left behind, the ones who must make sense of impossible revelations, carry a burden that no simple judgment can address. The yellow house in Laurelhurst has new owners now. They know nothing of its history. Their children play in the same garden where Victor once tended roses. The neighborhood has moved on, as neighborhoods do. But on quiet mornings, if you look closely at the upstairs window, you can almost imagine an old man sitting at a desk, pencil in hand, working on a crossword puzzle, encoding secrets, building bridges between identities, living impossible lives. And maybe, just maybe, in those final moments, when the pencil moved across the page and letters formed words and words became messages, he found something like peace. A spy who became a grandfather, a liar who learned to love, a man who spent his life hiding but died trying to reveal a better truth. That's the story of the grandfather whose crossword puzzles were KGB codes, complicated, tragic, and undeniably human. What do you think about Victor's story? Could you forgive someone who lived a complete lie but genuinely loved you? Could you reconcile the person you knew with the person they really were? We want to hear your thoughts, your opinions, your own experiences with difficult truths and complicated forgiveness. Please, take a moment to leave a comment below telling us what you think about this extraordinary story. And while you're at it, tell us your name and where you're watching from, what city and state. We love hearing from our viewers all around the world, and your comments help us create more content that resonates with you. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged your understanding of identity and loyalty and love, then please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next story. We have so many more incredible, emotional, thought-provoking stories coming your way. Stories of real people facing impossible situations, making difficult choices, living complex lives. And don't leave yet. There's another fascinating story appearing on your screen right now that we think you'll love. Click on it and continue this journey with us. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, remember, the truth is rarely simple. People are never just one thing. And the most profound stories are the ones that challenge everything we thought we knew.